I had Brother Sam hand out the paperwork. We're going to continue the book of Hosea. We transitioned, if you will, from the story. This is one of those stories that's I've been told before, and of course I became pastor here after being assistant pastor, and I tend to is this an on? I tend to go to and sometimes just for just for because y'all intimidate the fire out of me sometimes. I go to personal illustrations, and somebody told me early on, you need to quit doing personal illustrations. Just preach the word, preach the word. Well, what I like about the book of Hosea is wrapped up in a personal illustration, and I don't think personal illustrations are bad if they work. And sometimes it's a sorry about that. It's a good thing. So we went through the first few chapters of this, first three chapters, and he really get the main of those first three chapters is a personal story of how God directed Hosea to marry a harlot. Out of she went or he went to the place of harlot, the house, if you will, and house of ill repute, however you want to say it. And he went there and married this lady. I believe that he married her and then went through all that he went through, and I think the book is written on the back end of his life. So he went and he found this woman, God instructed him to, and he married her. He, in essence, tried to save her out of that lifestyle, but in doing that, he had three kids. And the first kid and the names of each one of the children is indicative of what the nation of Israel did. I don't know that Hosea even knew that when he was having this family, when he was going through all that he went through. But he had three kids, and with by the names of the three kids, when the last kid comes, it's the name means not my child. And so, as the story develops, it appears that after Gomer had married Hosea, was happy, excited, had a baby, still happy and excited, had another baby, but when the other second baby came, it seems like things weren't the same based on the name of the child. And then the last child was born with the name not my child. And right after that, in chapter 2, you find that Hosea is pleading with his children to talk their mama to coming back home. So apparently she's left somewhere between child 2 and child 3. She had a third child. Hosea didn't even know if it was his child. And yet Hosea raised this child with Gomer going back into that old life. And then as the story continues, Hosea, as an older fella, comes into the town meeting, if you will. And at the town meeting, that's where they sold and bought slaves. And he sees an old slave up there, an old lady, and he buys her. And it turns out he recognized her as Gomer. Can you imagine that bidding time when it stood there and how he wanted this? And I imagine the guy, the auctioneer, was probably, you sure you really want this girl? And she was old and wore out and just no use to you, and you still want to buy her. And Hosea said, hey, I love this lady. She's mine. And he purchased her back, all symbolizing what God has done for us. Stop and think what God has done for us. You say, well, how did he save us out of a life of whoredoms? Aren't we humans? Weren't we made perfect? Didn't we sin? After we sinned, didn't he send his son to die on the cross for us? And even though he died on the cross for us and we accept that gift of salvation, we get saved, but what do we do right away? 99.9% of us Christians, after we get saved, we go back into the old ways, don't we? Go back to sin. We go back into whoredoms, if you will. Opposite of loving God is focusing on the world. And God did everything for us. He made us, and then he rescued us in our sinful condition, and he pleads for us to come back to him. So it's very indicative of the Christian life, but the symbolism is also incorporated into the life of the nation of Israel. Israel did the very same thing. And God chose Israel out of all the nations to bless them. And that's part of the cool thing about the verse that we'll be learning this month. Kind of emphasizes that God chose out of all the nations. He had all the nations in the world to choose from. He chose the nation of Israel. Why? Because their great-grandpa, Abraham, was so trusting of the Lord, followed God. And God said, because of what you've done, your nation, your people are going to be my people. And what a tremendous thing that is. Jesus came and rescued the nation of Israel as the Messiah, the deliverer, to deliver the nation of Israel. But Israel rejected the Messiah, didn't they? And as a result, God allowed us, the Gentiles, non-Jew people, to hear about Jesus and hear about this Messiah. We didn't have all the symbolism. We didn't have all the sacrifices. We didn't have the tabernacle and the temple to teach us about these things. But God provided for us an avenue back to Him. And since Israel rejected God, the Gentiles have accepted Him, and that's where the church is. So when we get talking in these books of prophecy, and that's kind of the angle we're heading into, we're going to see some prophetic things about the nation of Israel. Let me just say this, lest we get confused in all this. The nation of Israel is who main subject matter is of the Old Testament. That's the nation of Israel. The majority of the prophecies in the Bible, in the Old Testament, have to do with the nation of Israel. Many of you have heard the 69 weeks of Daniel and going into the 70th week of Daniel, and the correlation between Daniel and Revelation, and the judgment of Revelation is tied to what Daniel is talking about, and it's all tied together. But in those two books, you don't find a whole lot mentioned, especially in Daniel. You won't find a whole lot mentioned of the church. In fact, there's a week missing, it seems, the 69th week to the 70th week. I believe the Bible's pretty clear that 69th week to the 70th week would be the church age, what we're living in now. And there's a lot of symbolism involved, and it would take great pains for me to try to teach all that, and I don't want to get too deep because the teenagers are already glazing over. Oh, Brother Dusty, you're going into deep stuff. We don't want to go to the deep side. So when we're talking about this prophetic stuff and what we'll see here, by the end of this chapter, it's going to slide right in there, some prophetic stuff going on, and I'll try to tie it up if I can get through what I want to get through tonight. By the end of this chapter, we're going to see some prophecy slide in there in relation to the end times. And so I hope we understand that. And one of these times I'm going to take more a deliberate approach to try to lay out the end times. Again, I try to do that every once in a while. I don't like to live there because it can get it's like cutting through red tape. It can get puzzling and odd, and so we're going to look at this as we get into this prophetic side of the book of Hosea, and pretty much the rest of the book steers away from the story of Hosea and Gomer and focuses more on the story of God with the nation of Israel. But the correlation can be made with God and His people. And so as we, the church now, are God's people, Israel's rejected God's avenue to Him through Jesus. We have accepted the Messiah, and we have an avenue to God. We, in essence, by virtue of our choices, are now God's people. And so as God's people, pay attention to what's going on with this nation, the nation of Israel that Hosea is dealing with. Now, the nation of Israel went through a period after Rehoboam became king after Solomon. And when Rehoboam became king, he made a horrific choice. He made a choice. He was approached by Jeroboam. Jeroboam said, we want you to relax the taxes on us. And Rehoboam went to the old guys, and the old guys said, yeah, it's a good idea. Solomon was in a building phase, and he built the temple and built the palace and had a lot of things building. The infrastructure's laid. We don't need all that money. go ahead and back off the tithes. But the young people came along and said, no, Rehoboam, you do that, then the majority of the kingdom's going to feel that you're weak, and they need you to be strong. So raise those taxes, raise them high, and be hard on the people. So Rehoboam, being a young man, said, you know what, sounds good. I'm super Rehoboam. And he had a big R on his chest. And just kidding, loosen up. And it's good. It's good. He wore a cape too. And I don't know. The Facebook world is saying, what? I don't know. He might have wore a cape, probably did one of those fancy robes, and maybe he did have an R on his chest. I don't know. But anyway, he thought he was tough and went to Jeroboam, and who he represented, Jeroboam represented, if you will, let's see, it'd be about 10 twelfths, which would be 5/6 of the nation of Israel. And the 5/6 of the nation of Israel decided, we're not going to follow Rehoboam. We're going to follow this young Jeroboam, who obviously was politically minded and set up by them as a leader. And so the nation of Israel splits. And so Rehoboam's left with a little spattern of 1/6 of the nation of Israel is Rehoboam's, and the rest are Jeroboam's. Now, the group that we're talking about is that 1/6. That's the group that Hosea is focusing on. He will mention Judah, if you will. He will mention them from time to time, but Hosea's judgment and the prophecy he's writing is dealing with the smaller group, if you will, that small tribe of Israel, known as Israel, the northern tribe it's called. And you'll see it here, and we'll reference it as Ephraim. And so we'll get into that and try to get into that. So God, in essence, is turning in chapter 4, turning the subject matter from the illustration of Hosea with Gomer. Now he's talking about how that illustration ties into his relationship and pictures his relationship with Israel, or Israel's choice in their relationship with him. So I'm going to read through what we talked about 2 weeks ago. Of course, last week we had Jotham Vanderdecker here. I do want to apologize. I meant to say something earlier. Because of the video he had and the background music, we couldn't run that. It wasn't run on the live feed because Facebook frowns on us using some of the copyright issues involved, and so that had to be out. It's not on. We didn't send out a recording this week. Sam sends out the previous week on YouTube. It wasn't sent out, and that's why. Because of technical copyright issues, never thought we'd have to worry about that stuff. But when you become a big-time TV preacher like I am, you can wear, I can wear my high-end Goodwill jacket. That isn't a Goodwill jacket. This is... Oh, this one's a 20-year-old jacket. And so I can wear my high-end jacket now that I'm on TV. And I'm working on getting the makeup. I need some help with the makeup. And because when you have this much face on the screen and this much light, it needs some help. So anyway, we're working on that. And just kidding. This TV preacher thing can go to your head, and pride goeth before destruction. And I might go viral or something. Who knows? But anyway, so I'm going to read through kind of to try to tie in from chapter. We end with the story, the illustration with chapter 3. Beginning chapter 4, there's a prophetic line, and I gave you the outline. I think that's sent out on Facebook. And the Lord of the faithless nation, or faithless Israel, if you will, in Hosea chapter 4 through chapter 14. So mainly the majority of the book now we're going to discuss here. Israel plays the harlot, much like Gomer did in chapters 4 and 5. How did Israel play the harlot? Under their number one, Israel rejects their knowledge of God. They knew God, but they rejected him as God. They didn't follow him. They went the route of whatever they wanted to do. And then it goes through down there, letter A, the mistake, letter B, the mourning, letter C, the massacre. You go through Hosea and you see those things, what happened. As a result, there is a massacre, if you will, or a killing, a separation of religion, of knowledge, and of heart. Israel was rejecting God. Israel's idolatry then is noted in chapters 12 or verses 12 through 19 of chapter 4. Israel's willing choice. In other words, Israel knew what they were doing and they willingly chose to reject God. And the fallout of those choices, letter B, the fallout of those choices is in verse 16. I left that in there from last week or last time we met. For Israel slideth back as a backsliding heifer. Now the Lord will feed them as a lamb in a large place. In other words, the Lord is done. Israel keeps messing up. They're on a slippery slope, going backwards. Instead, you ever been in a vehicle and you know you're getting stuck? And you want to get out, and so what do? You push the gas harder, right? And when you push the gas harder and you're supposed to be going forward, you know you're in trouble when you're supposed to be going forward, but you're going back. That's much what the nation of Israel has done here. And so Israel's turned into, they're sliding backwards, not gaining any traction. And then let us see, total rejection yielded total rejection from God. So Israel totally rejects God, and God says, I'm done with you. Verse 17, Ephraim is joined to idols, let him alone. In other words, God says, I'm throwing my hands up. I've tried. Now, as I mentioned before in passing, God uses for that northern tribe, the little tribe, the 1/6 of Israel. Is that right? The 1/12. 1/12 of Israel that remains. Is that right? 3/12, 2/12, 2/12, which is 1/6. I said it right. So 1/6 of Israel that's left that is following Rehoboam or followed Rehoboam, that northern kingdom is who he's referring to when he uses the statement of Ephraim. Now, God here then judges Israel, number 3, and that's where we're going to hit tonight and stay for the rest of the evening. God's judging Israel. And letter A under that, and this is in chapter 5, who God is against, or the responsible parties. Now, I laid this out. It's not. I didn't alliterate this on purpose because I had to explain it. I want to explain it rather than lay it out, get an alliteration here. Who God is against, or if you will, who's responsible for Israel's condition. Look what verse 1 says. Hear this, O priests. You see across I put responsible parties, I put dash religious leaders. God's saying, hear this, O priests, and hearken ye, house of Israel. So not only the responsible parties are the religious leaders, the priests, he also mentions the populace at whole, or the Israelites. He's saying you're responsible too. Give ear, O house of the kings. Not only was the priest or the religious side, not only the populace, but also the kings, which is the government side. He's holding all three parties responsible. Look what it says after the king. It says, for judgment is toward you, because ye have been a snare on Mizpah, and a net spread upon Tabor. If you notice, I left a blank there by Mizpah because I thought the name meaning was significant here. Mizpah is a watchtower. If you study your history of the Jewish layout, it was kind of a city built up, and it had watchtowers there that would watch over the area to keep the enemy away. And so it was a watchtower, Mizpah was, and a net spread upon Tabor. Tabor, also a high range, again, would be a nice spot for a defensive stand. So you're up and you're over where you can see if the enemy's attacking. So what he's referring to here is that the religious leader, the populace at large, and the government all had rejected God, and in essence had taken down those watchtowers, those protection things. Let me take a time out here and just talk to you, just people to people for a second. Did you know that God has a plan for us? And God's plan for humanity is for us to be good. The problem with humanity is humanity sinned. When humanity sinned, now the popular thing, the desired thing for humanity is for us to do wrong, which is contrary to what God wants for us. Also, it's contrary to what God knows is good for us. But yet, that's what we want to do. I, in my nature and natural state, want to do wrong. I do not want to do right. My wife has put me on a diet. I've been on a diet for a little while. Can you tell? No, not at all. Thank you, Brother Steve. Appreciate that. Nope, you look as fat as you ever did. But my wife put me on a diet. When I'm on the diet, do you know what that means? That steady diet of Oreo cookies that I have been trying to eat and been living on for, 10, 15 years or whatever it's been. She said, you can't have those. She put me on. Now we're counting calories. She's counting calories. I'm not counting them. She's counting them. And so she's trying to keep me from getting, in essence, eating myself to death. I want double stuffed Oreos at every meal. At least 4 is a good, healthy amount. You don't go too many than that. You want to make a glutton of yourself, but 4 is a reasonable amount. Only a half cup of milk so I can dunk them in there and get the flavor, and it's all good. 4 is plenty. She says that's too many calories. You want to use all your calories on those Oreos. Yes, I want to use all my calories on those Oreos, thank you very much. But then I couldn't live on 4 Oreos very long without eating my face because you get hungry eventually. And so we're counting calories, and so I have to be careful. Now, my person wants to eat Oreos. Something that tastes that good ought not be bad for you. But apparently it is. And since it is, you know what I eat? I've had to put the Oreos aside for salad. Oh, can I just tell you, salad's okay for bunny rabbits. It's fine for cows and horses and things of that sort. But for Oreo-loving dudes, not such a good thing. And so we've been counting calories but the truth is, I'm doing better. My blood pressure is not as elevated as it was. My pants are starting to be able to clasp without me turning red in the face to button them. My belt is not having to be, extended and expanded. And so I'm starting to feel better because I'm doing things contrary to what I want to do. Ultimately, that's what happens in humanity. We want to do wrong. God here is laying out that we're the responsible parties here, the guidelines, the guideposts that God puts down for us, the watchtower, if you will. The priests, the populace at large, and the government are supposed to keep us from those things that harm us so we don't get ourselves in trouble. Instead, all 3 of those facets failed the nation of Israel, Ephraim here, and they messed up. And the truth is that what's happening is God's preventative measures are now at fault. It looks like God's messing up. God's not messing up. People messed up. God's plan's right. And the truth is, even in our everyday life, our plan is not the right plan. His is. But I like my plan better than his. Why? Because I kind of have thought it through in my wisdom and expertise, and I know what's best for me. But in reality, I'm pretty dumb. And God's a whole lot smarter than me, and if I yield to him, he'll guide me. And that's kind of what we're getting at here, because look what verse number 2 says, and the revolters, that word revolters means rebels. The rebels are profound. Profound, that sounds good. What profound means is to make deep. They're deep thinkers. They're deep thinkers, but their deep thinking is putting them in a position to rebel. Why? Because our deep thinking is contrary to God. And he's saying here that are profound to make slaughter. In other words, we're good at killing ourselves. That's what he's talking about. That's what slaughter means, to kill or death. So he's saying we're really good. Humanity is really good at killing themselves. And do you know what? Analyze yourself. Are we not pretty good at killing ourselves? If left alone, if I left Sam alone as a little man, he would have had everything that he could fit inside of an electrical socket in there. He wouldn't have mattered if he lit himself up. He didn't care. He wanted to put something inside of the electrical socket. And one of our first big fights as father-son was me whacking his hand because he was trying to light himself up with now, Sam is alive at 24, right? You just turned 24. He's alive at 24. Do you know why? Because Daddy said no. And Daddy forced no. And Daddy told him, we're not going to do this because, son, this will kill you. Now, if I'd have left him alone, let him do what he wanted to do, he wouldn't have made it. I know he wouldn't have made it. And the reality is that's what we have to understand, that our rebellion is killing us. And that's what he's saying here. Though I have been a rebuker, that word rebuker means a discipline of them all. In other words, God said, I've done everything in my power to put obstacles in the way to gear you or steer you away from harm to right. And the truth is, that's what we forget. God put the Bible down. Too many people look at the Bible as, oh, it's a rule book. I got to follow all these rules. Well, you know why the rules are there? Keep you from killing yourself. Why? Because you're dumb. I know none of us like that. But if they didn't have a speed limit on the road here, how fast would you go? However fast the car goes. If you push that gas pedal all the way to the floor, that's probably how fast we'll go. Problem is that when going down Jefferson Pike, they made a cone, or it's got like a little shape to it like this. And if you go down too fast, as good a tires as you might have, they will still come off of that road and they will slide. And of course, in Middle Tennessee, roads go straight for just a short period of time. Then what do? Phew. So if you're going too fast, it will. So if you go at your own will, all of us would be dead. We'd be curled up around a tree somewhere. We'd be dead. Those rules are there to protect you. That's what kids struggle with. Do you know when kids realize how important the rules are? When they have kids of their own. Until then, they think rules are the dumbest thing. It's just my parents hating me and trying to force me to do what they think is right. Well, duh, but they got alive. They're old and they're alive. Not many people your age that think like you have lived very long. You have to have your parents help and guide you. That's why you got parents, because you're too dumb to do it on your own. I know we don't like it. Brother Dusty, don't talk that honestly to me. That's what we strive. That's what we as teenagers, part of the growing up is realizing, wow, there's a beauty in the rules. I don't know how many times my kids have called me and made statements to Laura and I about, wow, I can't believe you showed me this. And when I went to school, I knew stuff that the kids at school didn't know. Many of the kids at school, the girls go into school now, and Sam, when he was at school, they couldn't hold a job. The kids couldn't hold a job. You know why, Bro Steve? Because the boss told them to do something, and they didn't want to do it. So they told the boss, I don't want to do that. But when my kids were young, and they had a job to do, and they said, I don't want to do it. I said, I don't care. Do it. Well, it's not fun. I don't care. I didn't ask you about fun. Life isn't all fun. And then they throw out, that's not fair. And I would look at them right in the eyeball from when they were real little, and I'd say, life's not fair. Get used to it. Because ultimately, those of us that are older know life's not fair. We had to get used to it and deal with it. And the truth is that that's what God's talking about here. When he's talking about being a rebuker, he said, I'm a rebuker. I'm the disciplinarian. I've been disciplining you, but you're rejecting my discipline and you're doing what you want. As a result of doing what you want, what you're good at is killing yourself. And I'm trying to show you there's a better way, and that's what God's saying here. So God is telling the responsible parties. And then letter B, the nation as a whole. So he's going to talk to the nation as a whole. He says in verse 3, I know Ephraim, and Israel is not hid from me. For now, O Ephraim, thou committest whoredoms, and Israel is defiled. Now, let me try to explain what's going on. There's a conversation going on, and God's using Ephraim, if you will, interchangeably with the nation of Israel when he's talking about them. Ephraim, the name means double ash heap, a double ash heap. Now, underneath that, it gives another meaning, if you will, for Ephraim, or maybe a further insight. It's I shall be doubly fruitful. You say, where did that name come from? Well, it came from Joseph when he named Ephraim and Manasseh. He gave Ephraim that name. But if you read the story, and I put the verses down there, in Genesis chapter 48, 19 and 20, listen to what happens. And his father refused. This is Jacob he's talking about here. We're going back in time now. Jacob, his father refused, said, I know it, my son. I know it. What's going on here? Jacob is fixing to die. Joseph, his son, brings his children in for Jacob to bless them. When he brings them in, Joseph stands the children properly. Jacob's eyes are not so good, and so he's before these children, and on the right hand, this hand here, is always in the Jewish tradition, and most traditions really, the right hand is the strength hand, because that's, most of us are right-handed, so that's considered the strength hand. And so when you get a blessing, the most strength is transmitted from hand to hand. You say, well, that sounds spooky. Yes, but symbolism I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about some superpower, but maybe I am. Who knows? But there's a super E and a super M on Ephraim and Manasseh. I don't know. But anyway, so Ephraim, Joseph's oldest. Jacob can't see. Joseph positions them like this. Oldest one, Manasseh's the oldest one, ain't it? Manasseh's the oldest one. Ephraim's the youngest one. So Joseph put Manasseh here. He's the oldest son. And he puts Ephraim over here, so that when Jacob reaches out to bless his boys and touches their head, that he's touching the strong arm is the extra blessings going on to Manasseh's head, and the lesser blessing is going on the second child. That's just how it is in the Jewish culture. And so here you have a blind man. You have Joseph puts Manasseh, the oldest, here, puts Ephraim, the younger, here. And he says, okay, Dad, put your hands on my boys and pray for them. Jacob's fixing to die. Joseph knows that. He wants the blessing to be passed to the kids. Jacob, eyeballs closed, can't see, reaches his hands out. But when he reaches those hands out, he does this for his blessing. And Joseph sees that and says, well, wait a minute. You're messing it up, Dad. Dad, you can't see. You got to get it right. Manasseh's the oldest. He gets the double blessing. He gets the extra blessing. Put the right hand on Manasseh. Jacob says, son, I know what I'm doing. And he puts his hands like this. Now, let's read the rest of what I wrote there in Genesis, what I printed out here. And his father refused and said, I know it, my son, I know it. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. But truly his younger brother Ephraim shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations. And he blessed them that day, saying, in thee shall Israel bless. In thee shall Israel bless. There we go. Saying, God make thee as Ephraim and Manasseh. And he set Ephraim before Manasseh. So in the crossing of the arms, that Jacob's maneuver set up Ephraim symbolically, yes, but also completely before God. And so God said, this is how it's going to be. And God blessed, honored what Jacob did. You say, why did Jacob do that? I don't know. And I bet if you ask Jacob, why did you do that? He'd say, I don't know. God told him to do that because God had plans for Ephraim. Ephraim was supposed to be a great nation. Now, if you read up on Ephraim, you'll find Ephraim didn't do much. Really don't find much about Ephraim after that, and there's nothing there. You can look up in history, you see a little bit, but it's just not a whole lot there. But the nation, or his tribe, becomes somebody. God split it up and gave he had those 12 tribes of Israel. But God wanted to bless Joseph extra. So God gave Joseph 2 tribes of Israel. So you have Ephraim and Manasseh. When you look at the tribes of Israel, you don't see a tribe of Joseph, and that's why. And real quick, and I'll be done right here. Ephraim is the leader, and just for note's sake, the leader of Israel after Moses. Joshua was an Ephraimite. And then the first king of the northern kingdom, Jeroboam, was an Ephraimite, which is odd that he worked on the other side, if you will. The accents of the tribes were different and distinct enough that even at the time of the Confederacy, that when Israelites of Gilead, under the leadership of Jephthah, fought against the tribe of Ephraim, their pronunciation of Shibboleth as Sibboleth was considered sufficient evidence. And you read that story, that's a cool story in Judges chapter 12, 1 to 6. And they couldn't pronounce a word right, and it cost them their life. It was a pretty amazing thing. But here you have this whole nation, if you will, this whole group. And then another bullet point under there, Ephraim battles Jephthah and the Gileadite. And there's a passage there. Ephraim was a member of the northern kingdom until the kingdom was conquered by Syria in 723. And this is where Hosea is coming in. Right at this point, when that Assyrian army is coming down, if you will, on Israel and taking the northern kingdom captive. Ephraim is often seen as a tribe that represents the entire northern kingdom of Israel. Judah is, on the other hand, his tribe represents the kingdom of Judah, or the southern kingdom. Interesting passage. I put this down. We'll be done. Psalm chapter 78, verse 66 and 6 through 68. And he smote his enemies in the hinder parts. He put them in a perpetual reproach. Moreover, he refused the tabernacle of Joseph and chose not the tribe of Ephraim, but chose the tribe of Judah, the Mount Zion, which he loved. Kind of interesting development there. That happens because God has turned his back on the tribe of Ephraim, which was Joseph's household. It's kind of interesting. And actually Judah goes into captivity. The Babylonian captivity that we're all so familiar with is one that we're more familiar with, because you have Daniel, Ezekiel going, and you have their books that are written. The book of Hosea is talking about that when the northern kingdom went, a little bit before the southern kingdom goes into captivity. And we'll have to pick up from there. It's interesting stuff. This stuff gets really interesting to see how it all correlates. And what's really cool, if you carry it off and you work together. Now, I want teenagers, young people, listen up. Those of you in our homeschool thing, I want you to notice in verse 1 of Judges chapter 12. I want you to circle that. I didn't write it out for you. I'm going to read a verse, and the kids might remember this. The men... verse number Judges 12:1 says this, and the men of Ephraim gathered themselves together and went northward and said unto Jephthah, wherefore passest thou over to fight against the children of Ammon, and didst not call us to go with thee, and we will burn thy house upon thee with fire. The kids in our class on our homeschool class, we've been studying the first chapter of Judges. And if they'll remember that Ammon, you remember that word Ammon? Some of you probably don't. Ammon is a nation that Israel was supposed to annihilate when they went in there. And I believe it was Ephraim that was told to go annihilate the Ammonites. They didn't. And so now, hundreds of years later now, Israel is being in a battle here where Jephthah, the Gileadite, they're going up against Ammon, and it caused a rift between them and the Ephraimites. And it's an interesting battle. But I just want to point that out to the kids. It's interesting when in the book of Judges, if Israel had done what they were supposed to do, they would be facing a battle later on where Jephthah had to deal with the Ammonites that should not have been there. But they didn't do their job. I thought that was extra to point that out to the kids. The Bible is so interwoven with stuff like this. It's a very cool book, and I'll try to pull it together as we go. And we'll carry it on from here. We'll talk a little more about the book of Hosea, and certainly pick up here at verse number, we got only to verse number 4. Holy smoke, we're in trouble. Hosea's going to last forever. I won't take this long next time, but I'm trying to lay the groundwork, so bear with me. Let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we love you. Thank you for this book that you've given us, your word, and I pray that you'd help us to glean from it. Bless us going about our way, and bring us back again on Sunday, I pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you very much. You are dismissed.